There are more things in heaven and earth, goes the line in Shakespeare. Edward Snowden's revelations about hacked undersea cables familiarized us with large-scale spying and surveillance satellites. Surveillance satellites from space are as old as the Cold War. Now, though, where to fit in U.S. claims of Chinese balloons hovering in the upper atmosphere? What are they for? And what about the unidentified floating objects that were shot down over North America this past weekend? The Pentagon, so far tight-lipped on specifics. Is this something or is it nothing? The Biden administration choosing to go public with its allegations at a time of spiraling tensions with Beijing, even scrapping a visit by the U.S. Secretary of State, who might still meet his Chinese counterpart on the sidelines of a security conference in Munich this coming Friday. More broadly, is this to be included in the broader conversation over the West's dependence on Chinese goods, Chinese investment, and with the likes of Huawei and TikTok, Chinese tech? Does that interdependence keep the peace among superpowers, or are we going to see these tensions, balloon? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at this U.S.-China rivalry. Joining us from Washington, he's a retired U.S. intelligence officer, senior research fellow at the Atlantic Council, Nicholas Eftimiadis. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
You're the author of Chinese Espionage Operations and Tactics. Elizabeth Laris, adjunct fellow at the Pacific Forum, the author of Politics and Society in Contemporary China, is also with us from the U.S. Capitol. Welcome.
Good to be here.
Jean-Baptiste Monnier, Vice President of the Asia Center think tank here in Paris. Welcome back.
Thank you, Francois.
And welcome back to a former Beijing correspondent for the French news agency AFP, Pierre-Antoine Donnet. You're the co-author in French of, I translated it as, The China Files, Portrait of a Country on the Brink.
Right, on the abyss. On the verge of the abyss.
On the verge of the abyss, even worse. All right. Welcome back to the show, the France 24 debate, where you could join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Now it's Romania, Bucharest, scrambling fighter jets this Tuesday to monitor an aerial target that looked like a weather balloon flying in the country's airspace. It looks like it's innocuous. Same with the initial word on what was shot down over the weekend over North America. Where to lay blame? So far, nowhere. Still, everybody's on edge after that busy weekend. Monty Francis has more.
From the podium of the White House briefing room, it was a statement that could have been scripted by Hollywood.
There is no indication of aliens or extraterrestrial activity with these recent takedowns.
Not alien, but there continues to be a real sense of mystery surrounding the downing of 3 unidentified flying objects by the U.S. military since Friday. One over Alaska on February 10th, another over Canada's Yukon Territory on the 11th, and a third over the Great Lakes on Sunday, all of which followed the taking down of a Chinese surveillance balloon off the coast of South Carolina on February 4th. While the U.S. government has recovered debris from the Chinese balloon, so far the White House says it has not yet recovered anything from the other 3 flying objects or determined what they were.
We did, however, assess that their altitudes were considerably lower than the Chinese high-altitude balloon and did pose a threat to civilian commercial air traffic. And while we have no specific reason to suspect that they were conducting surveillance of any kind, we couldn't rule that out.
The White House said the flying objects posed no threat to people on the ground and that no communication signals were detected, that none of the objects had propulsion or were manned. As for their size, the Chinese spy balloon was some 60 meters tall and had a carriage the size of 3 school buses. Officials said the other objects were much smaller. One was cylindrical in nature and another in the shape of an octagon. On Monday, China accused the U.S. of sending balloons into its airspace at least 10 times in the last year, a claim immediately rejected by the U.S. For its part, the White House says China is operating a high-altitude balloon program that the People's Liberation Army is using to spy on dozens of other countries.
Let's begin, Nicholas Eftimiadis, with those 3 balloons over the weekend. Can you solve the mystery for us?
Yeah, People launch balloons all the time. Universities launch them, companies launch them. The United States launches 1,800 weather balloons per day. And that's just the U.S. So the administration is right at this point. No indication they're from China. We won't know that until the payloads are examined to see exactly what they are. And the likelihood is, and there are very, very few regulations on the launch of payloads, but the likelihood is that there'll be some type of scientific or weather payloads.
Why shoot them down? In one case, it's Canada asking the U.S. to scramble a fighter jet.
Because we don't know. And on the heels of just coming after what is a very, very obvious blatant blatant violation of U.S. sovereign airspace, I think nerves are a little hot at this point within the military as well as the public. So we're playing a better to be safe strategy.
Elizabeth Laris, just how high are nerves right now?
I think they're quite high. If there was only one isolated incident, people might just write it off as, okay, what's going on here? They shot it down. Let's now gather the debris and investigate this. And then the next thing you know, there's a second, there's a third, there's a fourth. Is there going to be a fifth tomorrow? So I think there's real concern in Washington, but also amongst the American public. And, one way of looking at this is, they could be weather balloons. Again, for what purpose? To perhaps study weather currents so that the Chinese can know better about currents in the U.S. for, missile launches or something like that. But they might also just be for surveillance, and that is to see how the White House and the American public responds to a violation by another country of the U.S. We really haven't been violated by a peer competitor and a challenger, and who knows, this might be like psych ops or a way of gathering information on to see how the government and the U.S. public responds.
Okay, Elizabeth, I'll read to you what in the Chinese government newspaper, The People's Daily, it says. An editorial says, it does not make sense for China to spy on the U.S. using a balloon the size of 3 school buses, while modern surveillance satellites can do a much better job, and surreptitiously too. Do you take the point?
I think China is going to use every tool in its toolkit to survey the United States. And balloons are a way to gather information. On the one hand, they are so high that apparently they've been missed, right? It seems like these have been drifting by. Now, mostly it appears, over Alaska, the Yukon. This one, honestly, may have drifted off of the course that it had originally intended.
But you can do the same from space, is the argument by the Chinese.
Well, no, not really. Not really. You do get different quality. You get different pictures. You get different information at different altitudes. So it is a bit of a different tool.
Pierre-Antoine Donnet, is this the first time you've heard of balloons like this?
What kind of balloons are you talking about? Football? No, the thing is that using a balloon is having its advantages compared to satellite for many reasons. One is that the balloon can stay on the same place for a while the satellite is going away. So the balloon can stay, let's say, 1 hour, time enough to really spy on the ground. Another difference is that being 18 kilometers above the ground or being above the ground 200 kilometers make a big difference. Of course, satellites, they can do very good pictures, but they cannot, for example, intercept communications on the ground. And this balloon was above Montana, was there on a specific purpose because everybody knows that there are, Minuteman nuclear missiles stocked there. There are also bases with planes, military planes. So this was not just by accident they were there. And on top of that, they are much cheaper than satellites.
Much cheaper than satellites. Taiwan says it's used to seeing what looks like weather balloons flying over its territory from China, but not the size of the one first spotted over Montana 2 weeks ago.
What the US discovered was a balloon. It got shot down a few days ago over South Carolina. It actually carried quite sophisticated equipment, including solar panels and reconnaissance equipment that has not been announced by the US authorities. We have not seen such sophisticated spy balloons sent by the Chinese Communist Party in the waters near Taiwan.
So it's a big one, says Jean-Baptiste Monnier, the Taiwanese in this case. Again, is it? What does it tell you? What you just heard there from that?
Right. So countries have been investing in balloons for quite a while, since 100 years, as you said, and then most recently in the 2010s. There has been, by the United States, a number of programs. One of them is the Raven Aerostar program, which there are large balloons, and they pretty much look like the Chinese balloon, the first one, of course. And that company also had a customer, which was Google. Google had a project called Loon, which was to send thousands of balloons around the world to provide internet to the half of the world who don't have internet. So that was in the 2010s. And a couple of years ago, all of these programs kind of collapsed. Yes, there was an advantage. There was ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance benefits. It's a backup, a contingency to satellites if something goes down. But you kind of go, to get a Chinese balloon all the way to Nevada, it's hard to get there, and you can miss, and you fly over once. So it's not reliable. There's limits to that. So the diminishing advantage of balloons is now established. The United States has pretty much given up, but the Chinese have not. So over Taiwan, this is right next door. You're going to take advantage of that, yes.
So the Chinese have not. The Chinese, who we saw in that report, are accusing the U.S. of flying balloons over its territory. Is it possible? Is it within the realm of possibility?
Oh, yes. I'm sure that, yes, absolutely. That was a program, again, that many countries invested in. If you were just a few miles across the strait, you can send balloons and get a lot of information out of it, for sure. But the stake is more of a... This is a game of chess. The Chinese moved the wrong balloon over the U.S. and the U.S. took the pawn, and that's it. And now it boils up to really confrontation between the nations, and rather than a strategic, geostrategic weakness or breach, it was a legal breach.
A game of chess. Nicholas Eftimiadis, I guess we're getting to the heart of the matter here. Is this a big deal or not? I mean, nobody among our viewers thinks that the U.S. does not spy on China. Both sides are superpowers. They spy on each other. That's what they do.
Well, so you got to understand that this particular event, first off, there are a lot of technical things that we haven't covered here, that capabilities that a balloon gives you that a satellite does not the least of which, as was pointed out, persistent surveillance, collection of high-frequency communications from military bases, cell phone communications, mapping, all those types of things. So the question is it in China's interest to do that sort of thing in what is a violation of sovereignty? Everyone does espionage. France does it, the U.S. does it, everyone does espionage. However, that's sort of in a shadowy world and expected between nation states. It's quite another thing to fly an apparatus the size of a jetliner over another country, violating their airspace, where the citizens are actually the first ones that see this and identify. So that's a huge difference here. And this may very well wind up to be a watershed moment in U.S.-China relations.
Does it seem, the way you describe it, as the Chinese made a mistake here, or they purposely wanted to go over those missile silos in Montana?
Oh, there's no question that they're sitting over the missile silos. We have what's called WGS, military communication satellites sitting over the U.S., which are communicating with those missile bases. So, of course, if you want to soak up those emissions, you have to be between the satellite and the ground station, which is exactly what China was doing. As they moved across, they're picking up the high-frequency communications, which are used specifically by military bases, maritime bases, aviation, for long-distance communication. They don't penetrate the atmosphere. They bounce off the ionosphere. So China, no doubt, and you can tell by the antenna size, what they were trying to pick up with that balloon capability, things they can't get from a satellite and things they can't get from people on the ground. So it's a very, very targeted collection campaign.
Elizabeth Laris, you agree with Nicholas that it is a watershed moment?
I do. And I believe that when the United States gathers up the debris, it needs to show what it can to the world and say, look, this is what's going on. We've caught the goods here. To me, this is reminiscent of the U.S. Surveillance, finding that Russia was putting missiles in Cuba. And President Kennedy at the time could have kept it quiet and done something about it quietly, but went to the UN and went public with the pictures and said, here are the goods. Because we do know that China has been sending balloons all over the world. So this is not just isolated to the United States. They've been seen now in the Middle East and in Latin America and of course, Taiwan. And so this is a very, orchestrated program that may have been going on undetected, or at least the U.S. government did not want to reveal to the American public until civilians actually saw it and said, hey, what's that in the sky? And so, until the intel comes out, there's still a lot that we don't know. But if the United States gets good intel and said this is from China and they're spying on us and they're gathering all kinds of information, I believe the administration needs to go public with that.
Is this a sign that China is stepping up aggressiveness, and I'm harking back to what Jean-Baptiste Monnier said about the West scrapping a lot of balloon projects, both public and private, the sign that, maybe Beijing is a little behind the times when it comes to its surveillance strategy?
Well, that's why we need to see from the debris, and we need to, find out from the intel community what they actually find. Are these, relatively low tech, surveillance instruments, or are they something like, wow, we had no idea China's had these capabilities, and they're floating around there, perhaps detected or undetected? Look, we don't even know if these have been detected before, but the government just doesn't tell the American public, right? So that's another story. And so right now, without the intelligence, we just don't know the threat. And again, is this just something that, is it a low-level form of surveillance that China uses, again, out of, the thousands of operations that it carries out? Or is this something new? The first balloon is not terribly troubling to me. It's the other ones that the White House has been relatively mum on that really has my curiosity, piqued my curiosity.
Yeah, we still don't know about those. Pierre-Antoine Donnet, is based on what you just heard from Elizabeth Laris, is the story the fact that there was this balloon and it was shot down, or is the story the communication strategy of the Biden administration, going very public with it and saying they spied on 40 other countries?
Well, if you look at the sequence, it's very interesting because, first of all, as you said, there was no way for the U.S. government not to hide that more because it was visible from the soil. The Montana people were seeing it for the first time, so they had to communicate. And then they said, we knew that already for a few years, but we wouldn't talk because we wouldn't. Actually, the reason is that we wouldn't like the Chinese to know that we know. But
they took it further, and it sort of harks back to what we saw a little over a year ago when the U.S. said, yes, the Russians are going to invade Ukraine, and went public with a lot of information, sensitive military information. This new strategy of transparency, is this part of that vein, or is it simply, like you say, because they were called out by eyewitnesses on the ground? Okay,
so now there are questions, series. One is that it was an accident. That this was not planned, that this balloon would go, over Montana and visible from the ground. And that's one thesis. There is another one, which there was a lack of communication between the military and the CCP or the Chinese government. I wouldn't buy that, because that came at a very sensitive time when Blinken was about to fly to Beijing. And so really, I think this is not really reliable. The other thesis is that, and this is more interesting, is that the decision came from some people inside the military system to sabotage the visit of Blinken going to Beijing, and by ricochet to actually diminish the influence of Xi Jinping. Another one is actually the worst one, is that everything was intended that the Chinese government wanted to make that public, to send a signal to the United States, to say to the United States and the rest of the world, we are here, and we have the power to do that. So you have to listen to us, and we have to now to negotiate on on a balance.
But do you think it would be in Beijing's interest to scupper that meeting between the U.S. Secretary of State and his Chinese counterpart?
If you see, at the first glance, no. But behind the scene, with the war in Ukraine, there are big pressures on China to decide between the West or Russia. On the Russian side, just a week ago, you had the Russian Foreign Ministry announcing a visit of Xi Jinping in Moscow in the next few weeks. Beijing didn't say that. They kept silent. But if Xi Jinping really goes to Moscow, while there is a war in Ukraine, that would be really a big mess.
And certainly the timing of it comes just as maybe not Russia's president is in Beijing, but currently it's Iran's president who is there, Jean-Baptiste Monnier. Iran, which is being ostracized by the West for its nuclear program, for supplying those drones to Moscow for its war in Ukraine. Is Beijing still hedging its bets, or is this a signal that it's going all in? And
the stake is the global south, and Beijing and Moscow are hand in hand to try to attack the global south and convince those countries to not just support them in the United Nations votes, but also in a variety of multilateral agencies, and also accept their assets. There is a base now in Africa, in Djibouti. The Chinese have opened that recently. So this is a stake, and we have seen indeed a lot of these countries either aligning their votes to China or to Russia, and we have to indeed understand. And you can see back to the balloons, when the balloons fly over Venezuela, the answer is, oh, a balloon, that's nice, no problem with us about that. When Taiwan says, oh, it is really a critical issue for us. So you can see the divides and the cracks lining up here.
And the U.S. is communication in this crisis is, again, is it? Do you agree that it's first off, the Biden administration caught out by ordinary citizens spotting that first balloon, or is this again part of a new way of a new transparency, if you will, in dealing with these superpower showdowns?
Well, I believe the other balloons were recorded for a few years. I mean, we know that there have been a number of instances of balloons flying over the United States and other countries. But I think the posturing, it's now posturing, and the United States has caught the Chinese with their hand in the cookie jar. Big slap on the hand. Now, I don't agree with Elizabeth. This is not a Cuban missile crisis. This is a balloon, so it has to be managed. But it's a time to understand more about China than we used to. What is the chain of command? Why did they do this mistake? Is this a threat? What's going on? And of course, we have also to understand that this is going to hurt China's GDP, because there's going to be measures against them. They're going to suffer. The semiconductor export control will be tightened on a number of companies. And so that's, at the time when they were ready to run, they're going to be facing challenges.
We said at the outset of the show how the U.S. is on edge, what with the shooting down of those other unidentified floating objects. But it not only, not to be forgotten, the Daily Mail trumpeting on its front page this Tuesday that the UK Prime Minister is ready and able to scramble the Royal Air Force to take on balloon bothers. But if London's concerned about spying, should it perhaps first pay closer attention to its own cell phone network, Huawei, with a strong 5G presence in Britain, here in France as well, and in Germany, which hosts the Munich Security Conference this coming Friday. Politico reporting how the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee Vice Chair Marco Rubio said U.S. diplomats should be aware of the risks and take necessary precautions. That Munich Security Conference, where that sit-down between foreign ministers, U.S. and Chinese foreign ministers, might still happen, Nicholas Eftimiadis. When it comes to surveillance, are balloons the big problem, or is 5G?
Well, certainly 5G. They're both problems, and for different reasons. The balloons are not an archaic system for surveillance. Lord, we use them in Iraq, we use them in Afghanistan. We have the whole southern United States border ringing with aerostats at 20 to 40,000 feet to conduct surveillance. So it's a very common capability actually used across the world. You design your intelligence capabilities to fit a particular problem set. And it's not a one versus the other. Huawei is a huge deal for the United States, for many countries, because of China's ability to go into those repeater systems, those 5G systems, and to suck out data or to alter it and delay it, which has profound implications for economies, for militaries, et cetera. Different collection problem, different set than what a balloon could be used for, which is anything from dropping drones that can go hundreds of miles, into a target site, all the way to collecting communications. So you use the tool in intelligence designed for that particular problem set. And with China, they have a very broad base of capability.
In the age of big data and cloud computing, should the U.S. be banning the likes of TikTok?
I don't know. TikTok's an interesting point. If not TikTok, what's going to be the next thing down the road? I certainly see the logic and the argument to doing that. And given the fact that China already has personal information on 85% of Americans, I understand the fear that's pushing towards banning TikTok. But I can't tell you I know the right policy decision at this point. Probably yes, but...
Probably
sure.
Yes, Jean-Baptiste Monnier?
I think it'll happen because there's so much. Nobody stands up for China in the Congress.
And will that happen here in France as well?
Well, we're looking at a global splinter net. I mean, China has banned all kinds of sites over 20 years now. They're banning TikTok, if you believe that. They have their own TikTok, but the international TikTok is not allowed. The app is not allowed in China. So now the United States is saying, hey, wait, we are also in our rights to ban some technologies. And I think it is clear that China's government has taken a huge stake in ByteDance, the owner of TikTok, and they control the data. Surprise, surprise.
Pierre-Antoine Denet, people watching this program from around the world, we're broadcast in Asia, we're broadcast in Africa. They're hearing about trying to ban TikTok, but isn't there as much information gathering on all those U.S. social media?
Well, yeah, it's not that. The real thing is that the content of the TikTok in the West is made in the West, but what is the intent from the Chinese side is, to have these young people using hours and hours watching this nonsense and not facing the real problems of the world today. When achieving that, they, in a way, already win. Because, you see, these young people, they are absorbed by these things, while the real...
So they're purposely trying to get young people addicted to TikTok.
It's perverse, They don't have to do anything, because using TikTok, it's watched by, millions of young people worldwide. And while in China, the content is totally different, and they limit the time of watching TikTok for the young people to 1 hour a day. So it's totally different.
Elizabeth Laris, you agree?
I think a lot of American parents would stand up and cheer if the U.S. government banned TikTok. I understand much easier, right, to prevent federal employees from having it on their phones, and many states, 30-odd states now ban it, on government phones. But try to take it out of the hands of the young people. This is a great tool for China to gather data on people's behavior, on different, thought processes, what are interests of young people. So we could use that for disinformation. China can use all that data it collects for its interests, for its soft power interests, for its media interests, to sway public opinion. So it's a great tool for China. But yeah, try to get it out of the hands of America's young people. Good luck there.
Last week, the U.S. Congress showed a rare display of unanimity. The House of Representatives, by a 419-0 margin, condemning the Chinese balloon incident. And there have been calls since by the powerful chair of its Foreign Relations Committee for a ban on export of U.S. technology to China.
I think shockingly, when the balloon was recovered, it had American-made component parts in there with English on that. It was made, parts made in America that were put on a spy balloon from China. I don't think the American people accept that.
Nicholas Eftimiadis, quick fact check. Were there U.S. parts in that balloon that was fished out of the sea off South Carolina?
Yes. And I actually have gotten calls from some U.S. technology companies with what do we do as the first question. So, yeah, and I do think the Congress is correct in some ways. I think there's going to be a reaction, a political reaction, and actually probably pretty unified reaction.
What's behind those U.S. parts? Was it a contract that was done, or was it stuff that was sold for other purposes?
Oh, it was stuff that was going to other companies and then wound up in the hands of the Chinese military. So it wasn't initially sold to any companies that had direct relationships with the Chinese military, but we see this pretty frequently. Hundreds of cases of contracts of things being sold and then the end user manipulated and moved in China. So it's a pretty common in U.S. exports. So you are going to see some of that. You'll probably see some other technologies, other foreign technologies mixed into it. And it'll raise the question of exactly what technologies we are going to sell to China and what the end state, what the requirements will be to ensure that that technology is used in the location that they said it would be. So that's coming, as well as you also have to remember this is a political year. We're stepping into the 2024 election cycle soon. So I think the reaction, not only in the Congress, but in the presidential candidates upcoming, is going to be pretty severe. And this is part of the reason I think this will be a watershed moment, just the timing.
Yeah, you heard Congressman McCall there. He hails from Texas, which is trying to pass a bill that bans foreign nationals from the likes of Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China from buying property in the Lone Star State. While the barbs fly between Beijing and Washington, so you've had a situation where you had protests taking place in Houston, Houston, which is home to nearly half of Texas's 250,000 residents of Chinese heritage, and they are against such legislation.
This law here is discrimination against one people simply because where he's from. We are all created equal.
I'm a veteran of the United States Navy, and I feel that there's many patriots in the military, in the uniform right now. Some of them probably have the same last name as me, and they cannot buy any house or land or property in Texas. That doesn't make any sense.
Elizabeth Laris, your reaction to that bid by Texas to ban Chinese people from buying property?
I believe that it was mostly, corporations not buying agricultural land, not individual citizens or even immigrants from China, buying a house. That's going to be a problem in Texas. Texas is a democracy and as the United States is, and there's going to be a lot of resistance to that. Yeah, they are going to say that smacks of racism. And it's one thing to say, okay, here comes a Chinese, agribusiness that is buying up, how many acres right next to our military installations, and then you have to, trace it back to China. Does it have connections to the Communist Party? It's going to be really difficult to do that with individuals. But if you make a blanket ban, the optics don't look right.
And this is all a reminder, is it not, Elizabeth, of just how, interdependent the United States and China are?
I'm not sure if it indicates that. I mean, Americans can't just go over and buy property, in China. Regardless of the threat, it's very, very awkward to say people from a certain country. I mean, the Chinese are going to start talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1800s, and this just goes down a road that's like, really uncomfortable.
How far down the road are we going, Pierre-Antoine Donnet?
Before talking about that, I would like to go back to the previous subject, which is semiconductor. In the 20s, Lenin said, "You will see the capitalists are going to give us the rope to hang them." And by selling semiconductors to China, this is what we are doing. So the American administration is very right to try to limit that and to make sure that the latest technology is not going to China because they are used for military. And so these pieces found in the balloon just show that the Western technology is helping the Chinese military system. So we have to stop that.
So what happens, let's push this further. What happens when there is a full ban on semiconductor sales to China?
Well, this is just putting the brake on the Chinese advancing in this technology because they are far behind. TSMC, the Taiwanese company, is doing semiconductors 5 nanometers, so already very small. Next year it's going to be 2 nanometers. Samsung is doing the same, while the Chinese capabilities is around 15 or 12 nanometers. So they are far behind. And this is a lot at stake in that. We have been talking about Huawei and all these sort of things. This is military, spying, and all that sort of things.
Pierre-Antoine Donnet, you agree with what he's saying, Jean-Baptiste Monnier?
I do. I think there is indeed a rightful action from the United States to try to constrain China because they're using the US-designed chips and Taiwanese fabs to indeed build some equipment. So I think the decision from October 5 last year to limit the export is important. Now, Holland, Germany, Japan are also part of this consortium and stopping these, the development of Chinese chips and the export to China. I think this has a major impact, and this is something China is very worried about because remember, Xi Jinping's vision for China was the Chinese dream was to lead on a variety of technologies from robotic to artificial intelligence. And I think there is a number of further measures that the United States could take, for example, in the area of software, open software, where 20 million Chinese programmers actually use these hubs to develop their own software. That could be a next step.
So, in other words, this, as you were sort of alluding to it, I forget the expression you used, a sort of an end of the World Wide Web.
Splinternet.
Splinternet, yes, that was it.
Right. So that's another reality. The fracture is all over. But yes, I think constraining Chinese data centers, drones, intelligence systems is the thing to do. I mean, until they change their posture vis-a-vis Ukraine, which is very important, vis-a-vis Taiwan and vis-a-vis South China Sea, and they know what to do.
Nicholas Eftimiadis, at the end of the day, does China want to rule the world or buy it? Is the question for critics of Beijing. Going down this path of the splinternet, to borrow Jean-Baptiste Monnier's expression there, where does it lead us?
Well, an old friend who was an ambassador told me many decades ago, China first tries to buy you. That doesn't work. They threaten you. And then after that, they don't know what to do. So, in the argument of buy or rule, that's sort of where they are. Yeah, I agree completely. There is a splinter net forming, and China increasingly, through international bodies, seeks to place global standards. So, but there is going to be that split emerging, and on one side you're going to have democracies, and on the other side you're going to have countries who are either benefiting financially, economically in their relationship with China, and lining up, accepting a more authoritarian rule.
You heard Pierre-Antoine Donnet earlier talking about how Xi Jinping has not confirmed that he's going to Moscow yet. In line with what you just said now, what are you expecting?
I'm sorry, was that directed to me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, you mean on the relationship between China and Moscow?
No, and just in terms of what you were describing just now, this sort of split between countries that favor a liberal order and those that don't.
Well, look, China has already said this publicly many times, that the world order and the rules it exists under do not serve China's growth and development. And it has made very clear that its intention to change, the Westphalian nation-state rules of order. I mean, it believes in a different way. It believes in the supremacy and the interest of the state over individuals. So it has a fundamentally different approach towards how the world should govern. And it highlights that as a great strength in itself. It says, look what we've done to raise 400 million people out of abject poverty. And that's an alluring message to much of the emerging world. So I think that they're going to continue with that. There'll be a struggle for control of international bodies, for control of standards, for acceptance of ideology, which will be pushed. China is pushing an ideology different from that of Western democracies. So this is the battle for the future. The espionage and the military threats and are all the mechanisms by which it's carried out. But the actual battle is going to be for one of ideology on how the world should move forward.
Elizabeth Laris, a final word before we go, especially ahead of this expected bilateral meeting between the U.S. Secretary of State and his Chinese counterpart in Munich on Friday.
Well, it's important that the two meet. It's important that countries talk, and especially during difficult times, that they meet. It's good that Blinken postponed his trip to China because he can't be going over right when China violated U.S. Air sovereignty. But it is important to meet on the sidelines of a meeting, that the diplomats continue to meet. China wants power. Power is the ability to influence other countries. And so all of its behavior is going to be pointed in that direction, whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative, whether it's military, whether it's surveillance balloons, whether it's diplomacy. It's all about having the power to influence other countries to do what China wants them to do.
Elizabeth Laris, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Washington. Ditto Nicholas Eftimiadis, Jean-Baptiste Monnier, Pierre-Antoine Donnet. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.